Good evening to our viewers around the world, and welcome to our weekly CJL Fireside Chat. We are privileged tonight and honored to have with us Gilad Sharon, with whom we will be discussing one of Israel's greatest legends, Ariel Sharon, otherwise known as Arik. Ariel Sharon was an Israeli general and politician who served as the 11th Prime Minister of Israel. Sharon was also a commander, a legendary commander in the Israeli army from its creation in 1948. As a soldier and then an officer, he participated prominently in the War of Independence, becoming a platoon commander in the Alexandria Brigade and taking part in many of its battles. He was an instrumental figure in the creation of one of the first commando units called Unit 101, as well as the 1956 Suez Crisis, the Six-Day War in 1967, the War of Attrition, and the Yom Kippur War. Yitzhak Rabin, and I believe also David Ben-Gurion, called Sharon the greatest field commander in our history. We have, and again it's an honor and a privilege to have with us Gilad Sharon, the son of the late Ariel Sharon, who has an M.A. in agricultural economics and management from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. In addition to writing a column in the Yediot, Achronot, and other Israeli papers, he is the author of a best-selling biography of his father entitled Sharon, The Life of a Leader. I can say that I have read that book cover to cover, and it is certainly worth it. You know, looking back into one of Israel's greatest leaders, soldier and politician, certainly well worth it, and I'm sure you can find it on Amazon. Gilad is married and the father of four. He lives in the family's farm in the south, which he has managed, I believe, for 30 years. He serves as a major in reserve duty in an elite IDF unit. So Gilad, it is a pleasure for being with us here tonight, all the way, I believe, from your farm in the south of Israel, in the Negev. Gilad, thank you very, very much.
Good evening, Rabbi. I'm honored to be invited. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Pleasure. So obviously, you know, we're talking about someone, a great leader, a legend, someone who so many of us have heard about, depending on how old they are, but for many, many years, involved from the very beginning of the story of the State of Israel. And I just want to start, like every good story, an interview from the very beginning. So I believe he's brought up in Kfar Malal, and obviously he's a young boy and grows up under the impressions of the local moshav there, with his parents. I just want to quote one or two things that I got from his book and some from your book. And if we can just discuss that to get an idea as to the upbringing of such an exceptional person. So he writes, and this is obviously as a young boy, he writes, security was a daily concern for everyone. So from the very beginning, it's an issue. By the time I was 13, I was helping to guard the fields and sitting in the dark, armed with the club and wearing the engraved Caucasus dagger that my father given me for my bar mitzvah. So here you have, this is not typical. It's not typical for any child today. It's not even typical for most kids in Israel. But this is how your father was brought up as a child. If you can just discuss, elaborate, and tell me how you think these experiences as a child affected the rest of his life, and also what if he ever discussed that part of his life with you?
Of course, we used to talk a lot, and he used to share his memories from the moshav when he was a boy. In Israel, there is a very tight and strong connection between the settlements, the moshavim, the kibbutzim, and the security of the country. The borders of the country were, I would say, were formed by the place we had settlements in, because when you have people living somewhere, so you have the motivation to guard them, to save their lives. And so this was the way the Israeli borders were shaped. Since a very young age, he was working on the family farm in the Moshav, before going to school, milking the cows, and after, when coming back from school, working again and doing his homework, and then guarding the crops at night, and then going to school in the morning. It was a hardworking family. I would say a strong contrast between a very high, I would say, a level of people listening to music, reading books, knowing things about modern art and about politics and science on the one hand. And his father was, he had a very good hand. He was drawing and he was playing the violin. And on the other hand, very hard-working people that came before the sunrise and, went to sleep when it was really late, and guarding at night. So this was the life that in his childhood that shaped his personality. In Israel, security issues was always on our mind, because we are a little country, a tiny little country. Sometimes people cannot believe how small the country is. Uh, it's like this, it's the size of New Jersey. That's it, the whole story. And we are surrounded by millions of people who they are sharing only one dream, to destroy Israel. It started on 48. We had no territorial dispute with Egypt or with Jordan or with Syria or Lebanon, but still they invaded Israel together with forces from Saudi Arabia and Iraq, countries we don't even have a mutual border with. So one can ask the question, why? Why is all that hostility? We had no dispute. We had no conflict with those countries. And I believe that the answer is that they never realized, that never recognized the Jews' right to have their own state in the land of Israel, no matter what borders. And this is what always brought the security issues here to be the first issue that everyone is worried about. Thanks God, nowadays the situation is much better. But back then, in the 1930s and 40s, and going all the years of Israel, this was the main issue.
So let's zoom in a little on that, because I guess what's unique here is a young boy who, at the very beginning of his life, that coincides with the beginning of the life for the state of Israel. And on the one hand, he's very much a part of the creation of that country. So let me just stop there for a moment. I mean, later on, there's another quote I have over here, that in 1941 and 1942, again, they were discussing the Second World War and the possibility that the German armies would invade Palestine or Israel. And they, to the extent that they were talking about, if they do invade, we would go to concentrate around Haifa and make a last stand at Mount Carmel. So this is in his very developmental stages of his life. There's existential threat to the Jewish community, to the Jewish people at the time. Do you think that that was more unique in those days and not so relevant today? And if so, how do you think it affected people like your father and that generation, as opposed to young Israelis today not necessarily feeling that same threat?
I think there's a difference. On one hand, we know the challenges, we know um, I would say the risks, and on the other hand, we are very self-assurance. We trust ourselves. We are strong, and we know it. So we have self-confidence. So on the one hand, you should always be alert. You should be careful and watch it. But on the other hand, we know that we can stand and we can hold. Even as a young boy, his feeling was that the Moshav fields were always no one will ever be able to invade the Moshav because the member of the Moshav are guarding it. His father, my grandfather Samuel, and the rest of the people of the Moshav. So as we were told as children, be aware, don't be afraid, but be aware, be ready. This is something that we grew up with. Uh, Now these days, thanks God, the threats are not as they used to be in the when the Germans were start coming here through Egypt. We don't have it anymore, but we still have dangers. I mean, Israel is the only country in the world that another country is threatening to destroy it. The Iranian, that's what they say openly, that they want to destroy the country, and no one says anything. They are members in the UN and everywhere. So I think that we are strong. We developed the country, although for so many decades. On one hand, we hold the sword, but on the other hand, look what we have here. We have a country with a Western level of life, very high standard. They have something, I don't know if you heard about it. They call it the World Happiness Index.
Yeah.
And so it happens to be that the Israelis, I think, maybe the most happiest people on earth. So who can know? I don't know why, but we're very happy. Jews have, I would say, optimism. I would call it optimism gene in the Jewish blood. We believe it's going to be good, and we're very happy with what we have.
Yeah, look, your father talks about that. We'll talk about that a little later because obviously you need a tremendous amount of confidence and optimism to continue to fight again and again. I just reading a little about your father's entry, becoming a soldier. So he writes that I think it was at the age of 14 when he was initiated into what was then the Haganah, and he takes the oath. He writes about in front of a Bible in one hand, a pistol in the other. So you're talking about your father then at the age of 14. What was it like when you were sworn into the IDF? And then, if you think about your children, your son, and then you've got three generations. How does that affect you? So again, on the one hand, it's your father, it's you, it's your son. The battle continues. How does that make you feel?
My father could have been a writer, a poet. He's very sensitive. He could be a journalist. He could do the thing that his first love. He could be a farmer. So one can ask himself, how come this sensitive, intelligent man became a warrior, a general, a leader? How come? And the answer is those are the circumstances, the Arab terror that never left our lives, and that's what made him go the way he went. Um, he didn't know that this is going to be his career. He didn't think about it. He wanted to go to university. First, he was accepted to the Hebrew University, to the Faculty of Agriculture, but it was back then in 1947. But only a few months later, the War of Independence broke. So he was in the military for 5 years, and then he went back to university in Jerusalem, learning the history of the Middle East. And then he was called to form Unit 101, the Commando Unit, and then he became the paratroopers commander. And then he stayed in the army for decades. So I would say these are the circumstances that made us serve our country the way we do. I still go to the reserve. I'm proud of it. My son is a combat officer. Uh, you know, we always keep we don't.
One hand on the book and one hand on the pistol. As I mentioned before, some of the greatest biblical heroes were all, even King David. King David was a poet. Obviously, he has a very sensitive soul. He's one of the great warriors. He's a political leader. So I guess, as you said, it's not necessarily that people want to be soldiers. They just have to be. And obviously, your father, filling in that void, that responsibility, becomes one of Israel's great soldiers, as we mentioned before. You mentioned the Commando Unit 101. So there he is. He's a young man, I believe, in his mid-20s. And he's outstanding. I believe it was the chief of staff at the time, Moshe Dayan, who recognizes that there's unique potential there.
It was McClef. The chief of staff was McClef back then.
Okay, sorry. So that was later. So they formed the Commando Unit 101, and he mentions that it has a fundamental, impact on the country's effort to rid itself of terrorism, and eventually was incorporated into the regular army, into the paratrooper unit. So tell us more about this unit, his role in that unit, and the impact that it had once it was incorporated into the IDF.
Rabbi, if I may, just to give in few sentences the background for forming this commando unit.
Go ahead.
The young IDF who beat 7 Arab armies in the War of Independence. After the war, people left the army, and the army became, I would say, weak. There were thousands of terror attacks carried out in the beginning of the 1950s. In 1953 alone, more than 3,000 terror attacks on Israel. And you must remember, this is the pre-67 borders. So the whole country is a tiny little place with terror hitting the moshavim and the kibbutzim and the roads. And so the IDF had no answer for that. Either the unit couldn't find their way at night, or if they did find their way, there was just exchanging fire with the Arab guards and retreating. And it seemed that the IDF is helpful. Back on that time, he was a student in Jerusalem, just married. And after another event, that 2 Israelis were murdered near Jerusalem, he was a battalion commander in the reserve back then. So he was called to the brigade commander. He was just learning for an exam in the university, but he was called immediately. He was told by Mishael Shacham, the Jerusalem brigade commander. He told him about the last murder that took place, and he said that we know where the murders came from, and if he thinks that he can collect few of his friends and carry out what do we call it?
Reprisals or
reprisal operation. So just I'm not going to talk a lot about the Nebi Samuel operation, just to give you the idea that someone that left the army already is being called, and he should collect some of his friends from the old days in the war, and the 8 of them will get a weapon from somewhere in the brigade, will collect it, will go at night, find the place. And so this was the situation of the army. And so he did took 7 of his friends, and they went to the village. They found the house of the murder, but the explosive didn't blow. It just went on fire, and everyone was awake, and they started shooting at them, and so they retreated. He came back very tired, but very unhappy. And in his report, he said that operation like this should be carried out by special units. And he forgot it and went back to the university. He didn't know that the brigade commander, Ariel Sharon, saw that he was absolutely right, and he wrote about it to Ben-Gurion himself. And then 2 weeks later, my father was invited to the chief of staff, McLeaf, that asked him if he's willing to form the commando unit and to be the commander of that unit. My father said, yes, of course, but if it's all right that one day I'll be able to finish my studies in university. And McLeaf said, I cannot give you any guarantee. And my father was a bit surprised. You take a civilian, you ask him to do something, but still he, of course, he accepted it, and the rest is history. The 101 unit was operating for only 5 months. That's it. And when it was at the largest size of it, there were 40 to 50 fighters there. That's it. That's the whole story. And still, the effect, the level of standard, the standard that he set over there, these are things that are still being talked about in Israel today in the IDF. And so Dayan, a few months later, became the chief of staff. And at the beginning, Dayan didn't like Moshe Dayan, didn't like the idea. He said every unit should be able to carry out such an operation. But when he saw the success, he thought that he wanted, but in a bigger scale. And so he combined the 101 unit with the paratroopers battalion. Now, in October 1953, my father was 25. After the first big and successful operation, Ben-Gurion, the prime minister, the first prime minister of Israel and the minister of defense, he was very curious. He wanted to know who's that young officer that not only gets an order, but also executes it. So this was the situation. And so at the age of 25, he was invited to the prime minister, and this is something, don't think that back then in the 1950s it's something that used to happen. No, it never happened. And ever since, he had an open door with the prime minister, with Ben-Gurion. And after combining the 101 unit with the paratroopers, the whole battalion became as effective as the 101 unit. And then it grew up and became a brigade that he commanded. And I would say the standard that he set there, you don't go back until you execute. And we do not leave our men behind. These are things and the level, the standard of execution. These are, I would say, three things that he said back then when he was a very young officer. He gave the political level the tool, because the army by nature is pushing for operations. But the political level, they have other considerations, diplomatic and so, but they should have the tool, because if they don't have the tool, so, we can never use it. So he gave them the option to choose what tool are you going to use, diplomatic, military. That's what he gave them as a 25 years old officer.
So let me ask you like this. Obviously, you're talking about something very special, someone who can really turn around from being sort of defensive to taking, a more assertive position and protecting Israel from these raids. And he's a young man, he's 25 as a young person. What are the traits, what are the character traits that you think your father possesses that obviously these people see in him and allows him to really, in a way, turn around and make the entire, ultimately, IDF much more effective? What are the traits you think your father possessed?
I'm not going to talk about his strengths and his, natural leadership, all the things that he was very intelligent and all that, and determined and strong. I think this is well known. I'm going to talk about his sensitivity. My father was a very sensitive man. with very good senses. He could feel when he got into a unit, he could one look at the soldiers and he knew exactly what he had. And the same goes for the enemy. Understand the feeling, the motivations. I think it was a great tool because it gave him something in addition to be just a military leader. I mean, he was a genius in his field, but I would say a very important tool was his sensitivity, his ability to catch immediately the feelings, the emotions, the motivation, and how to make his people, how to make them follow him, believe that they can do everything, there's nothing that can stop them. They believe in him, and he believed in his people, and they just proved that nothing is impossible, nothing. They carried out sometimes an operation after an operation, night after night. They could get an order in the morning and execute in the same night. Unbelievable.
Yeah, no, look, that's certainly true as a leader, someone who inspires confidence in very, very difficult situations. I'm looking here when he describes in 1947 during one of the battles, I think it was at Latrun, in the War of Independence. He writes like this. He says, "As the bonds between us," he's talking about the people he led into battle, and at that age he's a very young man. He says, "As the bonds between us grew stronger, I became more aware that the others had developed confidence in my ability to lead them into these actions and to get them out." So you're talking about something very, very special in that ability to connect with other people from a very young age. So yeah, obviously, as you say, there must be a great understanding and an ability to connect with others. Let's move on to the obviously there's many battles. There's always battles, but the next big war was obviously the 6-Day War, and he was a general in the south. But just a prelude, just before the war, most people didn't envisage the outcome. It was miraculous in nature, and the generals and even the generals and not the generals, even the political leadership with Levi Eshkol as prime minister, there was a lot of hesitancy as to what to do. And they talk about this, I think, this famous meeting that takes place a few days before the war between that political establishment and the generals, including your father, who was very, very outspoken and expressed tremendous confidence in the ability of the IDF. So again, sounding extremely optimistic and positive. What was the prevailing view in Israel at the time? And where does a young person, I think your father's probably in his late 30s, where does a young person like that get such optimism from?
He was sure that the IDF can beat the Egyptian. He was sure, and you should know, the political level will never be more certain in the ability of the army. I mean, wouldn't be more than the army itself. Uh, One exception to that, we can talk about it later, because when he was the prime minister, he had to push the army. So he didn't have the privilege that he, as a young officer, gave the political level when he was prime minister. So, but this is the exception. He knew that they can beat the Egyptians, and he was very, he had self-confidence. Just to give you an example, when he started the brilliant attack on the main Egyptian strongholds in the Sinai that were built by the most modern Soviet doctrine back then, just before he started, he was asked by the Southern Command if he would like to wait a few hours and then he will get the Air Force help before attacking. And he thought about it for a few minutes. And just remember, he was 39, a general, 39 years old. And he thought that there was no need for that. And he said, thank you, but no thank you, and went ahead with the attack. Now, usually, I would say the rule is that the relation, or what do you call, the proportion between the attacker to the defender in a strong in build position should be 3-1 in favor of the attack. But when he attacked the second Egyptian division, the same, he had about the same number of soldiers that they did, but they had a big advantage because their artillery was much stronger and went to much to a far distance. But still, his brilliant attack plan was, it all came in a sudden. First, you always believe in decision, what do you call it? Deceit.
Decisiveness.
Yeah, so he sent one force that will make the Egyptians think that he's attacking another place, Kusayme. And then he sent tanks battalion in a flank, a big flank through the dunes, where everybody thought that no one can go through those dunes, to isolate the area of the battle. And then he sent infantry brigade in a small flank to attack the Egyptians from the narrow front. And then he sent the engineers and the tanks straight ahead. And in the same time, because he had to take care of the Egyptian artillery, he sent the paratroopers with helicopters to take care of the Egyptian artillery, all in the same time. Very hard, but simple in the levels of the battalions and brigade. Very complicated in the level of him, the division commander, and it all like an orchestra. It all worked in few hours. The strongest Egyptian strongholds in the Sinai was clear. Well, the man was a genius. What can you say?
Yeah, look, he certainly, we talk about the operations ability to see the field and the changing dynamics and to make quick decisions. But I guess there's some psychological element here. You talk about the most difficult situations in which a human being can find themselves. This is not just life and death. This is for your people. This is for your country. He's always cool. He always seems to be cool under pressure. Obviously, the later wars, sometimes things were more difficult, but even then, he seems to be cool under pressure. How can you just talk a little bit about that? And does he ever lose confidence? He seems to be always taking a very optimistic view in battle. Where do you think it comes from? Where do you think deep down inside of him, where do you think he gets that constant positive outlook, optimism?
Well, naturally from his parents, but let me tell you how it all started. His military career. When he was 17, he was in a squad commander's course, not far from where we live today, in Kibbutz Ruchama, which was a very far place in Israel. And the reason that the course took place there is because the British mandate was in Israel and it was forbidden. And so they went to a very far place. He finished the course in the unflattering title of squad commander under supervision. He thought he was good, but his commanders were not impressed so much. But as he told us, 2 years later, when the War of Independence broke out, all his supervisors were gone, and he could he could do what he really knew. His coming up in the ranks was under fire. He never went to officer school. He got his officer degrees under fire because he was very quiet. And as the situation became more complicated and difficult, he became more quiet and self-confident. And he began, even as a sergeant, uh, he began to notice that the soldier in his platoon, they're coming close to him. They're waiting to see what he's going to do, what he's going to say, and they're following him. It just came naturally. And when he saw that, he felt responsible. His responsibility went higher, and he, I would say, drew confidence from the people that was looking up to him. And that's how it went. And I would say in the Yom Kippur War, when it was really hell, it went to a point that the soldiers, when they saw him, that they were like saying, Arik is here, oh, Arik is here, so everything's going to be all right. And they were holding his shirt physically, just touching him to be relaxed. And soldiers from other troops were putting the radio frequency on his, just to hear his voice. This is 40, and this was his code name. And when they were listening to him on the radio with his calm voice, they got their confidence as well.
Yeah, look, as you're saying this, I see, he once wrote, he says, I believe to control a battle, you must be with the forward units. 1 minute you are a general, and the next minute you're a soldier. So I guess, he's ready and he's able to do everything, whatever is needed, whether it's to lead and stand behind or going to the front or to, whatever. So yeah, look, this is a very extraordinary individual. Moving to the Yom Kippur War, obviously one of the dark moments in Israel's history, and we all have read and learned much about that battle. But obviously, in the beginning, the leadership was very uncertain as to its outcome. And as I mentioned to you before, I read somewhere that there was a lot of tension in the military leadership in the South at the time for various reasons. And someone suggested that maybe your father, who had recently retired, should not be involved. And Dayan, who was the Minister of Defense at the time, he turned around and turned to the generals and said that if anyone can turn this battle around, it would be Ariel Sharon. So, so you're talking about something very special. The turnaround eventually was extraordinary. It changed. Israel survived as a result, and your father was one of the ones most responsible for that turnaround. Can you elaborate on these, and how do you think that whole experience molded him or changed him as an individual?
First, Dayan was right. Let's go a few years before. When my father was in deep freeze in the army, he was not promoted for many years. And so after Dayan left the army, he came to talk to Dayan and asked him, what can he do? And Dayan, dealing with one of his antiques that he was rubbing, he told him, open his one eye a bit and told him, Arik, only if there's going to be a catastrophe, they'll call you. Then they'll call you. This is your only way to get out of it. In the Yom Kippur War, my father was already a civilian. He was division commander in the Army Reserve. He went to the war from our farm where I sit right now. He was called to the war, and he one of his qualities, he got immediately the idea. He understood that the Egyptians, they have the feeling of success. And so, as he said, the Sinai War was pretty much a war of brigades. Each brigade did what it did. The 6 Day War was a war of divisions. But he said this war, this is something else because the size, the amount of forces that the Egyptians managed to bring into the Sinai and the feeling of success that they had. Remember, we talked about he's getting the impression, the feelings, and it means a lot. Uh, uh, so all that he saw that the only answer for that is using a more than one division force. This is what he suggested. He knew exactly what they should do. I would say from political reasons, and I'm so sorry to say it, but this is the truth and we cannot escape from the truth. Back then, the army was under political influence. This is the reason he never became chief of staff, because he wasn't in the right party. Only someone from the Labour Party could be a chief of staff, and then they became member of Knesset from the Labour and ministers and so. And he was on the other side of the political spectrum. And so he knew what had to be done. And eventually he wanted to cross the Suez Canal from the beginning to break the Egyptian spirit. Eventually he got the permission for that. It was a terrible fight. His division lost 300 men during this the crossing of the Suez Canal battle. But this operation, this movement, a brilliant, bold movement, changed the course of the war. And from a huge defeat, it became, I would say, Israel's most the greatest victory we had, standing 100 kilometers between the IDF forces and Cairo with no Egyptian force in the way. This is how the war ended. I think that if they would listen before, we could save many lives. But that's what happened.
Yeah, look, you see, along those lines, your father was known for his views, and there are many in Israel who have similar views. He writes that his strong view was that the upper echelons should intervene in the battle only if they are actually on the battlefield. So even if someone who's had a lot of experience in the past, but if he's not there physically present, taking it all in, he can't make decisions. Now, your father was known as, that was his view. Others. What was the view of other major commanders, generals at the time?
You're right. So I mean, the army is built on very strong discipline, and I would say you must follow your orders. Otherwise, an army, especially during a war, cannot exist. But there's one assumption that there's a strong assumption behind it, meaning that the commands you get, the orders you get, coming from someone who knows what's going on, and that he's rational. And we didn't have those two conditions. The commander, Gordish, the commander of the Southern Command, lost it. He was not. I want to be very gentle with it, but mentally he wasn't able to function, and they were never there. They never came to see actually the most important IDF battle in the war. They never came. Dayan was the first one who came there on the October 17th. After the Suez Canal crossing, he came and he went with my father to the other side, Africa as they call it, and he understood that day that something happened. No one else came. So even for that, he always had special feelings for Dayan. That has his he had his problems, but he came there to this hell on earth and saw himself what's going on. But this is what it's all about. You can give orders, but you have to know what's going on. Otherwise, you can send people. Used to say to a very difficult missions in which there's high chances that they will be hurt, but they must know that you know what you do and that you considered everything. And after seeing for yourself, you gave the order. But the orders that the higher command of the IDF back then didn't follow those conditions.
Yeah, look, obviously that was, as you said, one of the most stunning victories in terms of the turnaround and what, God forbid, could have happened. Let's move aside a little. We're talking about his ability on the field as a soldier, as a commander, as a general, and also understanding the morale of his people and also of the enemy. We're trying to understand, where it all comes from and what's deep down inside. And he writes about his love for the land. Obviously, you're fighting for a cause, you're fighting for your people, you're fighting to protect the land. I saw an interesting comment. He says, when the land belongs to you physically, when you know every hill, why, and why you watch it, when your family is there, that is when you have the power, not just the physical power, but the spiritual power. So you're talking about someone with whom this love for Israel, this love for the land of Israel is very, very ingrained. How do you think this played out in his life as a soldier, commander, and as a political leader?
Look, we cannot lose any war. We cannot be defeated because this will be it will be our last war. I mean, the Arabs got they were hit on 48, on 56, on 67, on 73. But they can afford it because we seek for peace. We say shalom when we meet each other. This is our dream. As Golda Meir said once, and it's not someone I like so much, but one thing that she said, if the Arabs will put down their arms, there will be peace. If Israel will put down its arms, there will be no Israel. So we have no choice. We are fighting for our lives.
Yeah, look, certainly. He was always very instrumental. He knew the land. He knew the land very well. Certainly, from 1947, the War of Independence, and through all the wars, and also later on as minister in various capacities. I want to talk a little about going back to something very basic, and that is, he writes, as a Jew, it is my historic responsibility to defend the Jewish people. So you're talking about a person who has profound responsibility for his people. And he says, I feel the responsibility. So you're talking about, you're right, beneath the surface, there's a very, very sensitive individual who feels this profound responsibility. And then he writes, we're not going to accept any decision by anybody else about security for the state of Israel. It is our role and only our role. How do you see that playing out in your father, and any conversations that he might have had with you on the subject?
He always said that Israel should always be able to defend itself by itself, not to be dependent on anyone else, because we don't have the time for it, and I don't think anyone will come. Whatever what we'll do is what will happen, and we should always have the ability to defend ourselves by ourselves.
No, exactly.
If you look at 2,000 years in the diaspora, you can see that he was right.
No, 100%, 100%. And Israel's history, whenever they did things on their own, they came out on top. And unfortunately, when they were undecisive or waiting for international support or opinion, things didn't go as well. He's got a great sense. Any person, who lived and fought in the way that he did is obviously thinking about these things. And I saw at the very end of his book, the epilogue, he writes about Jewish continuity. And he says, we are, after all, as you mentioned, a people of almost 4,000 years of history, one generation to the next, a people who, despite everything, have been able to overcome whatever was inflicted upon us. And he says it is the responsibility of our generation to sum up that genius and hope that link remains unbroken. So, you're talking about someone who really feels that connection. How do you think your role vis-a-vis his role has changed? So there you have the founding, soldier, leader, etc. But then perhaps your generation, the second generation, and then the third generation, the generation of your children. How do you see that change?
He always used to say, first thing, I'm a Jew, before everything else. So it's something I believe in. I feel as a part of a long chain. I have responsibility for my forefathers, and I have a responsibility for my children and the coming generations. And I see that it's a long Jewish existence, and every generation has its own responsibility in his time, and this is our time now, and I feel it. I feel it very strong. This is why I go to the reserves still now. I mean, I can handle my rifle very well, and
Yeah, look, it's certainly in the genes. I mentioned to you before, we know that he had a relationship, a fond relationship with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. You can call it a special relationship. And I know he writes that after his son, Gore's death the tragic death of Gore in 1967, the Rebbe had written a beautiful letter, condolence letter, and had a warm relationship with him. The Rebbe also had a good understanding, he writes, of certain military matters. I think the Bar-Lev line, and just generally, he was aligned with many of his military views. How would you describe that relationship, and what did it mean to him?
first, Rabbi, let me tell you, I'm sure you know it, but most of our family became Chabadniks, you know that. So,
Yes, I hear.
you took most of us.
We're all one. We're all one family, as they say.
Of course, leave something. um, Very strong and tight relationship with the rabbi. It started exactly like you described. The rabbi wrote my father a beautiful letter after my eldest brother was killed. And then, Chabad is the discipline is much stronger than the army. You remember the late Shlomo Medanchik, the head of the village of Kfar Chabad.
Yes.
He came, after in Chabad after the people saw what the rabbi wrote. Shlomo Medanchik became a part of our family. My cousin married his daughter, of course, but my father visited the rabbi. He loved him. It was a mutual love. They were in touch for years. And the rabbi was a very special man, as you know. And so I think it makes sense that the two of them they they had such a good relationship, and it went so well together. I can understand it.
I remember, not from the time I wasn't born, but straight after that miraculous victory in the 6-Day War, where the Rebbe encouraged people to put on tefillin. There's a famous picture, I don't know if you've seen it, of your father putting on, the great hero, Ariel Sharon, putting on tefillin in front of the kotel, which was very inspirational, certainly to many who wouldn't otherwise have put on tefillin. So no doubt your father was a great military general, a great leader, minister, prime minister, who was proud, as you say, more than anything else, to be a Jew, and recognizing the connection of our people to our country and to our history, and that we are a link in the chain. We just have a few minutes left. I just want to ask you a question. How would you describe his legacy?
Since a very young age, lifeguarding the lives of Jews in Israel and around the world. This was the mission of his life. This is what he did, saving Jews, protecting them, forming settlements. There are more than 100 beautiful places in the Galilee, in the Golan Heights, in Samaria, in Judea, in the Negev, in the Arava. So he was a proud Jew who was in the, I would say, the personal level, great man with great sense of humor, very sensitive, with great love to his people and for the land of Israel, and served the country, until the last moment.
If there were 2 or 3 words, single words, that would describe him, that you could use to describe him, what would they be?
He was very sensitive. He was very intelligent, very self-determined, very strong. He was a leader. People followed him for good reason. He was a leader. He was a reality changer, but he was a great leader.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Gilad, we thank you so much for sharing those views, the insights, personal insights, experiences that you had with your great father. You merited to be born into that family. You saw the best, and we hope that his memory be an inspiration and a guide to many young people today to be courageous, to be sensitive, as you said, and to be proud of who they are, and not to be afraid. Gilad, we thank you so much for this evening. I know it's very late in Israel. It's almost 11 o'clock. And we want to take this opportunity to wish you and all your family, your wife and 4 children, that they should continue to make you proud and make your father proud. And as I mentioned the other day, I met an Israeli a few years ago, and he told me that he's not sure he believes in God, but to him, religion means one thing. And that is, before he makes any big decision in his life, he asks himself one question. And that is, will this make my grandfather smile? So I want to wish that you should continue making your father smile and proud, but particularly your children, before they make any big decision in their lives, they should ask that same question. Gilad, thank you very much again. Have a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you for inviting me.
Gilad, our pleasure. Thank you.